Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Ask an Atheist. I am Andrew Seidel, the Director of, of Strategic Response here at the Freedom from Religion Foundation.
And I am Sam Grover, Litigation Counsel here at FFRF. And today we're going to talk about the unsigned emergency order the Supreme Court issued at midnight on Thanksgiving Eve in the case Roman Catholic Diocese of Brooklyn v. Cuomo, which also resolved a companion case called Atheist Israel of America v. Cuomo.
That's right. And I mean, this case is a big deal, and Sam and I are going to break it down for you. Basically, the Diocese of Brooklyn and this Orthodox Jewish group challenged the state's public health orders, claiming that they were religious discrimination. And the new Supreme Court, with Amy Coney Barrett, agreed. She may even have written the opinion.
That's right. She may have written the opinion, but Andrew, you wrote an op-ed for Religion Dispatches skewering the decision. Everyone should go read it. There's a link on the FFRF website. You called the opinion, I believe, a midnight bombshell, and wrote that a, quote, metaphorical bombardment is particularly apt here because this opinion weaponized religious freedom and came as something of a surprise to the country, though, of course, it shouldn't have been.
Yeah, I did write that. The writing's, it's a bit sodden, but the warning really is not overblown. This is a scary decision and I think a very bad omen of things to come. The court went out of its way to weaponize religious freedom. But wait, hang on. Before we get to that, Sam, you got to set the case up a bit more for us and our listeners. What really happened?
Oh, sure. Okay. So essentially, in response to rising COVID rates in New York, Governor Cuomo issued an emergency executive order to protect people from the spread of this deadly virus. Many states have done similar things. This order specifically restricted occupancy at all places of business based on a couple of factors, including what the business does and how severe the COVID outbreak has been in that business's area. The order divided areas into different color-coded zones, with red and orange zones having the most restricted occupancy and lesser restrictions in yellow zones. Zones were determined by data on infection rates, the way you'd want it. So two churches.
Wait, so real quick, so you're saying that science and data dictated this public health order, because that's kind of an important thing, I think. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, exactly. This order and the restrictions that it created were informed by scientific data and what scientists and medical professionals tell us are the ways that this virus spreads.
Okay, seems important. Continue.
Yeah. So two churches then sued the governor over his emergency order. They took issue with the 10-person and 25-person limits on worship services in red and orange zones. They claimed that those restrictions violated their constitutional rights to freely exercise their religion.
Yeah, basically they were claiming religious discrimination. And before we dive into the merits, let's talk about why the court never should have decided. We never should have seen this opinion in the first place, right? This never should have happened. Tell us why.
Yeah. Okay. So sort of government 101, courts in our country are limited to deciding actual cases and controversies. That's sort of the legal term of art. Courts do not issue advisory opinions or decide hypothetical cases. If a dispute no longer presents a live case or controversy, then the courts, including our Supreme Court, are obligated to dismiss the complaint for lack of what's called standing, lack of standing to sue and to get your issue decided in courts. And that should have happened here, but it did not. Basically, both churches and all the justices acknowledged this in their opinions. Both churches that sued Governor Cuomo are now in yellow zones, the least restricted color-coded zone, and are thus allowed to operate at up to 50% capacity. And by their own admission, the diocese and Atheist Israel have been operating quite contentedly at 25% and 33% capacity for months. So in other words,
go ahead.
Yeah.
I mean, I was going to say the orders don't apply, right? They didn't apply to the Catholic and Orthodox Jewish groups that were bringing the case. Is that what you're telling us?
Yeah, I mean, they're still obligated to comply with the order, but the order allows them to operate at higher capacity than they have been operating at. The governor of New York has granted them more relief than they have asked the Supreme Court to grant them. So
they've already got more than they wanted.
Yeah, the courts are not able to give them anything more than they have right now. That's not a live case.
Yeah, and the way Chief Justice Roberts phrased this, I loved it. He said it makes no sense for the court to order the governor not to do what he's not doing, right? So they're ordering the governor to give these churches more relief than they already got. And, I mean, to me, the interesting thing about this, Sam, was if you listened to the conservative media or even some of the conservative justices in this case, right, they treat this as like the order changing and shifting as like this conspiracy to prevent the court from deciding the case. But it really wasn't. The orders are meant to be responsive, to be nimble and constantly shifting and updating with the latest data on the spread of the disease. So the whole goal is to keep people safe while giving them and businesses in the community as much normalcy as possible. Do I have that right?
Yeah, that's correct. And actually, in my personal opinion, that's not really the best way to go about this. That's sort of government falling prey to this idea that we should have as much normalcy in this really terrifying time as possible, and sort of caving to public pressure to allow businesses to stay more open than they probably should. But that's sort of that's the executive order that New York came up with, and it's really making as many concessions to businesses as possible, and even then
it can be dangerous.
Churches aren't happy.
Yeah, it's never enough. I mean, and so I've been saying that this decision really did weaponize religious freedom, because religious freedom has always been, and you and I have been talking about this for a long time. Back when we could go to Free Thought Hall and shoot the breeze in between cases and lunch and stuff like that, we would talk about this pretty regularly. Religious freedom has always been this personal protection that allows believers to believe whatever they want and then act on that belief, worship, so long as they're not harming or injuring other people or violating the rights of other people. And that is what the ultra-conservative Christian nationalist bloc on the Supreme Court is changing, right? This short, unsigned opinion, which we should say was joined by Thomas, Alito, Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and Barrett, the last three being all three of Trump's appointees. It said that churches have this right to religious freedom that includes the right to risk the health and safety and lives of everyone in the community. So the justices took this hallowed constitutional protection and turned it into a tool to afflict and wound. They basically took a plowshare and beat it into a sword. But to do that, they really cried religious discrimination here. That's right.
And they have done so disingenuously. The lower court in this case found no religious discrimination for good reason. Essentially, the governor of New York could have crafted restrictions that did not name churches at all. Could have just said, basically, any business where people come in and sit down and stay for a long time, including movie theaters and concert halls and also churches. All those businesses are all subject to this one set of restrictions. He could have done that. Instead, he specifically separated out places of worship and gave them less restrictive guidelines. Basically,
so he separated them out to favor them. That's what you're saying.
Yes. And the majority on the Supreme Court said, aha, because you have named churches specifically, now instead of getting deference from the courts, and sort of that deference is called rational basis review. The courts, because you've given churches special treatment, beneficial treatment, you get strict scrutiny. You get the most demanding test to try to pass, and under that test you fail. According to
it's like kind of presumptively unconstitutional under that test. But I really want to drive this home for our viewers, because to me this is one of the most amazing points, because these judges, though they are definitely not the smartest jurists in the country, and people should stop thinking of them as such, though Sonia Sotomayor would be right up there for me. I mean, there was no discrimination in this case, right? Churches were treated more favorably than other organizations and entities that they're nearly identical to. So, like, if you read the opinion, there's the unsigned opinion, then there's Gorsuch's opinion, there's Kavanaugh's opinion. Those are both concurrences. And the five justices, they variously complain about hardware stores and acupuncturists, whatever you would call an acupuncture place, a liquor store, bike repair shops, accountants, lawyers, insurance agents. They're all open with fewer capacity restrictions than churches, but religious worship is different than those one-on-one businesses and stores, right? In a church, people gather in large numbers. They're indoors. They're close together. And even if they're spread out during the service, they file in and file out at the same time in crowds gathering near the doors. They sing and they pray and they chant, all of which helps spread the virus. And we know that churches spread this virus. We've got on the FFRF website a ton of examples of news stories where we got churches spreading the virus. At one point, more than half of all the cases in South Korea were tied to religious worship. There was one worshiper in Ohio that infected, I want to say, just shy of 100 other people. And half of those people who got infected had never stepped foot in the church. So it was one worshiper who infected other worshipers. They took it home and infected their family members. And then their family members actually took it home, took it to work and infected their coworkers. Governor DeWine, I think he said it spread like wildfire, and this was before things got bad. So churches are different than liquor stores or bike repair shops or those one-on-one acupuncture, lawyer, insurance agent appointments. They are, as you said, they're like going to a movie or talking or taking in a play or listening to a lecture or watching an indoor sporting events. And all of those were banned under the New York orders that the churches were
shut down 100%. Right.
I mean,
all businesses
to me that
similar to churches shut down 100%, while churches are allowed to still have some capacity, even in these red and orange zones.
That's the crazy thing.
So that was discrimination.
Yeah. So when you compare apples to apples, churches are favored. They're given these special privileges. But as you said, right, that wasn't enough, which is just, it's mind-blowing. So I want to ask you, one of the things that I think we've kind of talked about, and we wrote that blog a few years ago about thinking in constitutional absolutes killing Americans, and I was reminded of that this morning. We were talking about in the context of sort of the Second Amendment and giving people this absolute right to religious liberty. And kind of what the court said is that you didn't give the churches the most favorable treatment possible under this law. So we're blocking the order because anything less is unconstitutional. And I've been thinking about that. And in other words, right, the right to religious freedom is now sort of the top of this, all of a sudden, a hierarchy of rights. Not all these rights being equal, but like this is a right that trumps everything else. And I'm concerned that I think we're going to see this conservative bloc deciding other rights also get more favor. Second Amendment rights. And some rights are going to get less favor, right? Like reproductive rights and possibly the right to contraception could get downgraded. And that haunting possibility that we've been talking about since Barrett was nominated, equal marriage.
Yeah, I completely agree. There's this case raises a lot of red flags for just how far the justices are willing to go in ignoring reality and the facts presented to them, and just sort of creating their own set of facts and using those to come to the conclusion that they want to. The dissent in this case calls out the majority, and specifically Gorsuch, for doing this, because Gorsuch really goes a step beyond the majority in basically regurgitating this meme that if you're allowed to buy liquor but not worship, like where's the justice in that? The obvious answer is, well, when it comes to the spread of a virus, going into a store for 5 minutes to pick up supplies, regardless of what those supplies are, that doesn't raise a huge risk of infection.
Yeah, like, people aren't going into the liquor store and sitting down in the aisles together and singing for 90 minutes, right? And they're not all arriving at the liquor store at one time. It's spread out over a 16-hour day that the store is open.
Exactly. So like that's not an apples to apples comparison, and the justices all know that, and the majority is willing to just ignore that inconvenient reality in order to push this religious freedom agenda. It's worrying.
It's deeply worrying. And one other thing that really shone through in Gorsuch's opinion, and I agree that you're right, people ought to go read the dissents, especially read the dissent by Sotomayor. She is just amazing when it comes to religious freedom and state church issues. She really gets it and gets it right almost every time. And her writing is clear and well-reasoned. I highly recommend that. If you want to understand this case, read her dissent first. But one thing that really shone through in Gorsuch's opinion, we were talking about this before the show, is that I think labels are killing Americans here, right? Like essential versus non-essential. The justices really seemed to chafe at the government not listing churches among the essential organizations, and not because of their rationale for doing it, right? They're deciding this based on risk factors. That's what the government was deciding it on. But it's that label, right? Like essential organizations are those that mitigate risk factors or which meet these basic needs like food and air and water and medicine, and religion doesn't. And I think, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this, I think that was and is viewed as an affront that cannot stand by the justices.
Yeah, my advice to any governors out there trying to save citizens' lives by creating new emergency executive orders would be to label churches as like super essential. Just like give them a special label. They're extra essential, and then you can do common sense regulations to them. It's a little bit tongue in cheek. Like that obviously wouldn't work. But you're right that the justices seem at least to be feigning this like pearl clutching, right? Like, oh my gosh, you've said that worship is non-essential. And obviously religion has a very particular place in a lot of people's lives and is very important to them. But like it can also be done from home. Like I can't go grocery shopping in my own home. Like they're different things.
And I mean, and you and I talked about this too, and I've been wondering about it for a while. I wonder if that designation had not been essential, essential, but if it had been a different word or phrase, something boring, even like whether or not we would have had such a rebellion against these public health orders. Like if you had labeled it infrastructure related and infrastructure unrelated, or something like that, or maybe you could even flip it, like flip the feeling of this like stamp of one's lowly origins to this divine thing, and say, okay, there are organizations that meet basic needs like grocery stores and hospitals, so we're going to label them basic, and there are organizations that meet higher needs. So we're going to label churches as like, would we have had this rebellion if churches hadn't felt so insulted by a label that is, as you were just pointing out, like 100% true?
Yeah. I mean, my honest answer to that is I don't think the Supreme Court is going to get a request from a Catholic diocese that it doesn't want to grant, sort of regardless of the circumstances. But it's
elaborate on that. Elaborate on that for everybody, because I don't think a lot of people would understand why you just said that.
Oh, I mean, the vast majority of the justices on the court are Catholic now, or were raised Catholic, and the religious right, that sort of agenda is being pushed by the Catholic diocese, and well as a few others.
Yeah. So I mean, you have Roberts, Alito, Thomas, Barrett, and Kavanaugh are all practicing Catholics, and Gorsuch was raised a Catholic, though I think he identifies maybe as Episcopalian now.
Episcopalian.
So,
Yeah, that's right. So completely not representative at this point of the country, right? Where a full 1 in 3 people are non-religious. I believe the non-Catholics on the court are still religious, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think the other 3 are Jewish. So I mean, you've got a Catholic and Jewish Supreme Court that represents that would be a less than a third, probably closer to a quarter of the country, and that's it, which is pretty amazing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we're not saying that religious people are incapable of giving the non-religious fair shake, but these particular justices in the majority, until proven otherwise, I'd say that there's no claim that the Catholic diocese could bring that they're not going to approve.
So we're getting some questions, and they're related to some of the things that we were going to talk about. So I'm just going to dive in. Well, actually, no. Let's go ahead and finish because we need to talk about Roberts and Gorsuch first.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So, Andrew, a lot of people are saying that Roberts sort of did the right thing here, and some are even talking about him and the other conservatives as having had like a falling out in this opinion. What's your reaction to that?
Yeah, I that's way overblown, and people are giving Roberts too much credit here. Everybody needs to remember that Chief Justice John Roberts is still very much an ultra-conservative member of the Supreme Court. The only dissent that he's ever read from the bench was in the Obergefell decision, the marriage equality decision. He was so angry about it, he got up and read his dissent. Roberts might even have been on board with the constitutional question in this case. He wrote that it may well be that such restrictions violate the free exercise clause. Right, so he might have even agreed with those other 5 justices on the merits, the content of the decision. The rift between Roberts and the other 5 conservatives is not ideological. The split is about how to implement that ultra-conservative agenda. And Roberts wants to move slowly to help preserve the legitimacy of the court, because doing that helps preserve the legitimacy of the conservative changes that he's going to make. Right. Clarence Thomas, Sam Alito, they've chafed for more than a decade at this incrementalism. And then with the 3 new Trump justices, they don't have to hold back anymore, right? So this wasn't a rift. This was more of a rebellion against Roberts continually pumping the brakes on that conservative change. They all agree on the need for that change. It's just how quickly can they impose it on the country? And Roberts wants to do it slowly so that it seems more legitimate. And now he's not going to get the opportunity to do that because there are 5 justices who are clearly very ultra-conservative Christian nationalist activists. And it is really important, too, that I don't know if we've made this clear, that without Barrett, this case would have gone the other way. So Roberts would not have weighed in on the merits. So it would have been either 5-4 the other way or maybe 4-4-1. So Barrett is the only reason that the case swung this way. And there are a lot of people who think that she wrote the opinion in part because of how poorly it's written, and it seems to be a thread of inexperience shining through the opinion. Though, in my opinion, that could also mean Alito wrote it as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. To continue with your metaphor a little bit, Barrett is the one who finally gave this ultra-conservative bloc on the court the green light to take the brakes off the vehicle, right? There's now nothing stopping them, no sense of propriety or sense of wanting to preserve the court's legitimacy long term. There's nothing stopping them from just ruling this way in all future opinions, radically changing the contours of our law with no regard for precedent. And that should scare everyone who cares about true religious freedom, which includes the separation of state and church, and everyone who cares about a variety of other issues that have been protected.
So
that includes access to abortion and gay marriage marriage equality, all those things.
I mean, yeah, and we're going to have to talk about where we think this is going to go. I'm deeply alarmed at what this signals. I mean, again, going back to the first thing that we were talking about, right? The justices went out of their way to do this. They didn't have to. They wanted to. They seized on this case, the first case they could with Barrett on the court when they had a 5-person majority to do this. They were eager. They were chomping at the bit. So it is deeply alarming for a number of reasons. And we're going to take questions now from the audience, because I know this is scary and I know it's confusing, and hopefully you learned a lot about this decision, because there's a lot of bad information out there, and it happened on Thanksgiving and people kind of came back into the world on Monday and we're like, wait, what? So we're going to take some questions. If you've got questions, go ahead and ask them in the comments right here on Facebook. You can send an email to askanatheist@ffrf.org, which I should have said at the beginning of the show, but we've already got some questions rolling in. And I want to take a swing at this one first, Sam. Jared asks, as far as the Constitution is concerned, I think all limits on gatherings are wrong. The government can make recommendations that we isolate and limit gatherings to 10 people, but the minute it starts punishing people for attending church, it violates the right to assemble. So kind of taking it out of the free exercise, religious freedom, and more talking about the other First Amendment right to assemble. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so there's no right in the Constitution that's absolute, right? So the Constitution prohibits the government from abridging our freedoms, but the government has interests, and we have imbued the government with certain powers that includes protecting us from things like pandemics, right? So like the safety of citizens affords the government certain powers, and I think the right to assembly, while super important, is not also a right to spread your infectious disease to whoever you want. I don't know if that's maybe making too light, or I don't want to straw man Jared's
No,
comment.
I think you're right there, Sam. I think that's the key point. I think that Jared is missing, that there's one absolute right protected under our Constitution, and that is the right to think freely. Every other right has and should have limits, right? Like, you have the freedom of speech, but you don't get to threaten other people's lives, right? That's a limit on your speech that we all agree is worth having and is there. You have the right to worship as you see fit, but that doesn't give you a license to kill your child the way God asked Abraham to do, right? That's still murder. There are limits on all of our rights. And that includes the right to assemble. You can't come onto private property and assemble. That's a pretty sizable restriction on your right to assemble. So none of those are absolute, and most of the limitations we agree are worth having. And this is just the same. And I think it's worth reiterating, Sam, that it's not just about the people going to church. Right, they're not the only ones getting sick. And that Ohio case is a great example. 98 people at the worship service. I think like 48 of them, I think, got sick there, and then they took it home to like another 48 people. The numbers aren't exact, don't quote me, but about half the people who ended up being infected never even attended the church service. It was family members, and then those family members took it to work with them, and so you have infections all down the line. And then not just that, and Sam, I'd love you to talk about this. That's putting pressure on our medical system, right? It's not just the people going they are wreaking havoc all across the country outside of their churches by going to their churches.
Yeah, that's exactly right. My wife is a doctor and regularly treats COVID patients, and that's the message that the medical community is trying to send all of us during this time is, hey, we live in an interconnected society, right? Your choices don't only affect you when it comes to things like pandemics. The virus spreads, and it puts a burden on our healthcare professionals, and some of them have paid the ultimate price for other people's selfishness. To return to Jared's question and bring it back to the religion context, the long-standing rule has always been the government. You are free to believe what you want to believe and to act on those beliefs up until the point where you are breaking the law, and the law is allowed to dictate what we can and cannot do when it is crafted in a neutral, generally applicable way, right? So as long as the law isn't targeting religion specifically and restricting it sort of vindictively, then the law is fine, and religion doesn't get special benefits just because it's religion. That has been the rule for a long, long time, and this Supreme Court is now trying to craft this new rule that is absolutely untenable, which is that if you have a religious belief, you are above the law. And there are too many religions in this country that believe too many different things, and those beliefs are can be super flexible when it's convenient for those who want something. That this rule is untenable. There may well be a lot of religious people who have sincerely held beliefs that they aren't manipulating in order to get special benefits from the government. But we know that there are religious people who are willing to manipulate their beliefs and make claims in court solely for the purpose of circumventing the law.
And I remind everybody that we saw that pretty clearly in the Hobby Lobby case, the convenience of religious belief in the Hobby Lobby case, where Hobby Lobby as a company had been invested in the very drugs that it said violated its religious freedom before the case started. So again, just going to the convenience there. And I say it was really well said, Sam. And just to simplify one point for people, your right to swing your religion ends where the rights of everybody else begins, just like your right to swing your fists ends at somebody else's nose. So we got a bunch of questions. They're rolling in here fast. So Josh asks, do you know if other countries shut down church gatherings and if that helped drop the infection rate? I know that. Go ahead, Sam.
I have an anecdotal example. I have a good friend, a college friend, who's lived in Taiwan for several years now. And I believe the entire population of Taiwan is about gosh, I don't know about the population, I guess. It's about the size of Connecticut. So it's not like a huge place. It's not the United States. Mm-hmm. But just the culture there allows for more government restriction, and the country locked down when the virus first reared its head. And my friend regularly on like group Skype calls now just laughs at us, because for months now he's been leading a normal life again. Wow. Because the government took quick, decisive action, common sense action based on the advice of experts, and basically the COVID's over for them.
If only. And there's some more anecdotal stories. I already mentioned South Korea. At one point, more than half the cases in that country were tied to a few Christian churches. One worshiper in one church infected 1,200 other people. She was the 31st person to get COVID in the country. So that was one of the things that led to the spread there. And that's a country where only like a quarter of the country is Christian, I believe. There was another huge outbreak in somewhere in France, where a church had a massive kind of like a revival or a worship service, and it was people then flew to all these other countries and spread COVID all around the world. So just countless examples of that, and we know that shutting down works. There's, as Sam was just pointing out, we know it works. So Christine Scott she's got a comment. She says, the church is just looking out for their own financial interests. It has nothing to do with caring about their members. And I don't know about you, Sam, but
thank you for your comment.
I didn't see anything about caring for members anywhere in their arguments. There was nothing that they were that they cared about the health and safety of their members. They tried to talk about how they self-imposed all these safety regulations, but this was not about caring for their members. This was about religious privilege.
Yeah, I guess another point on that too. The justices in the majority gave the diocese and the Orthodox congregation a lot of credit for not having had an outbreak yet, while operating at 25% and 33% capacity.
The rules are working. You haven't had an outbreak. We're going to go ahead and destroy the rules.
Exactly. And also, when you engage in risky behavior like this, you're rolling the dice, right? And not everyone is going to be punished for that, right? Like, you're taking this unnecessary risk that could have terrible implications for yourself and others. And if you get away with it, even for a long time, that doesn't mean that your actions are justified, right? That's sort of outcome. That's results-based thinking, that's not what we need right now. And the fact that the justices are willing to go in that direction when it suits them just shows that they're willing to think illogically and come to the results that they want rather than the results that make sense.
Yes. Amanda Shamanda says, I was under the impression that according to Christians, God is everywhere. So who needs to go to a church?
Yeah, I mean, that kind of goes to my point that during a pandemic, like, there are other ways to worship rather than gathering in person. And I don't even think that the religious groups bringing these cases are making credible claims that they need to meet in person. Now, the courts aren't going to look into the sincerity, really, of the religious group's claims, and that leaves a lot of wiggle room for religious organizations to manipulate the courts, which they have in the past. But the bottom line here is Amanda's right. People can worship from home. People can't. Not all people can get food from home, right? Some people are going to have to go to grocery stores, and so these are different. These businesses are different.
They really are, and I mean, I think that's the crucial point that people need to be hammering home when they're talking about this with their friends and their family. And we got a question kind of on that front, which is, do you have any tips for how I can push back against my religious family who are pressuring me to travel home since Christmas is such an important holiday to them? It was easier for Thanksgiving since that's not a religious holiday. And we are seeing the spike from the Thanksgiving travel already seems to be starting if you were looking at the COVID data. So this is a good question. Do you have any tips, Sam?
For pushing back on your religious
family? Against religious family who are pressuring this person to travel home since Christmas is such an important holiday to them.
Yeah, it's really tough. I mean,
it is.
Extraordinary situations call for extraordinary action, and I think you have to try to explain to your family that you're doing this out of love, right? You care too much about them and their health and the health and safety of others. You care too much about that to ignore the reality around us right now.
It is the selfless decision, and that's what needs to be recognized by everybody. Staying home and not risking people is the selfless thing to do. Traveling and going to see your family, that is the selfish thing to do. Jay, it's hard. I really do sympathize. Jay asks, what avenues does the current administration have to combat the biased courts? What's the likelihood that the current administration could add members of the court to have a more balanced council? So this is my hobby horse, and I'll get up on my soapbox. I mean, I think this is super, super important. Right now, there's not much that the current administration can do. But our courts are broken. The courts have already been politicized. The courts have already been packed. I mean, we're talking. They're still. The Senate is still confirming Trump judicial nominees right now. We're probably talking about close to 250, 260 by the time all is said and done. Between a quarter and a third of the judges at every level, district court, circuit court, and Supreme Court, are going to be Trump judges. We have to figure out a way to fix this. This is deeply, deeply problematic.
Yeah, I'm very interested in seeing what the new administration is willing to do. But my guess is that unless those of us who really care about these issues put pressure on the administration to do something, they will sort of adopt this institutionalist mindset where preserving the appearance of legitimacy of the courts is more important than fixing the courts.
I think that's right.
The courts are already broken, and if one side is trying to protect this appearance of normalcy while the other side destroys the institutions, that's untenable. So we need to fix the courts.
Yeah, and we've talked about this on a lot of previous episodes of Ask an Atheist. You can go check those out, and on Free Thought Radio. This is a really important issue for us. And I should say that a little more to Jay's point, adding seats, I think, is probably the only viable solution. I don't think term limits is a solution that's going to work because of what the Constitution says about how long judges get to keep their seats. So I worry about that. So that, I'm going to call that our last question. But Sam, if you've got final thoughts, or if you've got any other questions you want to ask or chat about, I'm happy to do that.
Yeah. So in terms of what FFRF is doing while we await any solutions from the courts, we're continuing to follow these cases. We're submitting amicus briefs in cases at the federal level, at the state level, Supreme Court, and courts of appeals to make sure that your voices are heard. And we continue to confer on strategy internally about what to litigate and where to push when we can. And so we're doing everything we can, but it gets harder and harder because the fix is in.
So well said. And we're doing a lot to educate too. I mean, shows like this, op-eds like the one that we talked about at the beginning of this show, we're doing our best to educate the public about what these decisions really mean and why they're wrong and why they're contrary to the law and the Constitution and how broken our courts are, which is crucial. And we hope that you watching will take that message out and also encourage people to help FFRF in its mission to educate and to fight for the separation of state and church, because we are in the fight for our lives and we need all the help we can get right now. So Sam, thanks for joining me to chat about this today. It's a fun conversation, if depressing.
A little bit bleak, yeah.
A little bit bleak. But that is our episode of Ask an Atheist for this week. Thank you all for joining us. I really appreciate you taking the time. We got an exciting show for you next week. FFRF's Director of Government Affairs, Mark Dan, is going to be talking to Representative Carlos Guillermo Smith, a state legislator from Florida. He is the state's first LGBTQ and Latinx legislator, and he also identifies as an agnostic. In the meantime, check out our website, ffrf.org, and we will be back next Wednesday at noon Central Time with another episode of FFRF's Ask an Atheist.